Okay, so over the last couple of classes, I've tried to trace out the shift from classical or neoclassical to romantic poetics, and I'm not convinced that I did so as well as I would have liked to have. I thought it was a little bit confused. So I want to reiterate something about Johnson's. It occurred to me I curtailed my discussion of Johnson. So I just want to make the clarify Johnson's contributions and then Burke's interaction with Johnson, because I see that conversation between those two gentlemen as particularly important. And what I'm going to want to do in my challenge on the course is, and I'm taking this course together with the course that's yet to be taught, namely in 20th century and 21st century literary theory, which is where most lit theory classes begin. So in most universities, if you study literary theory, you don't even study it as a discrete subject anymore, like you used to. You used to have it tagged on at the end of the degree, like we're doing as a fourth year class. And when I encountered it in the 1980s, it was regarded with significant suspicion by the academy itself. Lit theory existed as a class, but it was appended to the end of things. This is something to think about, but not that something that preoccupies the discipline. But now in undergraduate syllabuses, it's right there front and center in the first class. You will meet literary theories in your very reading of the text. So you'll be given a perspective on the text, and the perspective will be, and then there's a variety of possibilities there, all of which, in my assessment, the way I'm organizing this and categorizing it, are anti-humanist in their intent. So some of them it could be from a feminist point of view, it could be from the perspective of queer theory, it could be from a post-colonialist perspective, but at any rate, whatever the perspective is, or it can be an accumulation of all those. They're perspectives through which you read the text from the beginning, without any discussion of whether the perspective that is taken is legitimate or not. It's just assumed that it is, and that it's very clear that perspectives that were taken on the past literary theories were, in some sense, oppressive and certainly illegitimate. That assumption, which unfortunately the student in first year English, it's also there in high school English now, unfortunately, as well. You're never actually brought to the point whether you can consider for yourself whether that perspective is legitimate or not. It's simply assumed that it is, and you as the reader have to read Jane Austen as somebody who had insufficiently understood the problems of feminism, and herself was sort of caught in a world in which she was an apologist for the very thing that was oppressing her, more or less. Or if you read Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you will see it as a text not criticizing colonialism, but to some degree perpetrating colonialist narratives. You could go on and on. The way Shakespeare's taught is similarly taught from the vantage point of a particular perspectival view, without interrogating whether the perspectival view deserves to be considered as perhaps erroneous. The aim of this course is to, as I said from the beginning, to give you vantage points that existed before that, what is usually called a postmodern turn begins. I don't call it postmodernism, I call it anti-humanism. It's called postmodernism because modernism promotes a view of rationality and a view of objectivity, and postmodernism questions rationality and questions the very idea of objectivity. It says there's no such thing as a neutral perspective and so forth, all of which you're acquainted with. But the problem with that characterization, modernism, postmodernism, is that it assumes that rationality begins with modernism. It's an invention of the Enlightenment. And I've tried to argue throughout the course that rationality is a part of human nature, understood in the classical era and in the Christian era. Remember last time I mentioned that Boethius says that a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. That's what a human person is. So it has a rational nature. So that this is long before the Enlightenment. This is the 5th century AD. And furthermore, that the medieval and Renaissance periods assume the rationality of humanity, in fact, so much so that we could argue that they're too rational in their presentation of everything lines up, everything makes sense, everything's harmonious, everything influences everything else. It's all part of the what's often called the Elizabethan world picture, which I've introduced you to in classes when we're talking about medieval and Renaissance periods. When we're talking about Lewis and Tolkien, I talk about the worldview of the Renaissance, the medieval worldview, what Lewis calls the discarded image. It's entirely rational, everything about it, whether you're in the humanities or in the realm of nature, whether you're in the trivium or the quadrivium, it's all rational. So the idea that modernism introduces rationality and postmodernism disputes it is itself insufficiently schooled in the long history of thought. And so we've tried to break outside of that modernist Enlightenment paradigm when trying to look at literary theory. And so I wanted to say that first of all. So the very terms modernism, postmodernism, I think are problematic because they present modernism as rationalistic and postmodernism as anti-rationalistic, but as if rationalism was a feature of the scientific era, when it's just simply not. It's just rationality has always been assumed in the Western tradition to be the thing that distinguishes mankind from the animals. And that's why I said last time when we talked about Rousseau's discussion of language and his positing of the origins of languages in grunts and cries, he's actually appealing to an idea that the very thing that distinguishes human beings, that namely that we use language, is actually closer to our feelings than our reason. So it's the beginning of a different, and we might want to say postmodern, but definitely a romantic view of language, which contradicts the whole Western tradition. And it's not just pushing back against the Enlightenment, it's pushing back against the whole classical and Christian era as well. So this is why I'm taking a broad picture and constantly going back and forth on it. And we will then, and I've tried to use paintings to illustrate this, and I used this last time, this picture, Las Meninas, and the idea of perspectivalism. You know, again, this is sort of a characteristic of the Renaissance painting. The subject is front and center, it's light, other things are in darkness, but we can see various other people looking at the girl here, including the parents here who are in a mirror probably behind her and distracting the girl, etc. But you can see that she is front and center. That's going to fit broadly within the Western tradition of focusing on the foreground. Whereas, as I've said, and I'm going to come back to this picture and not spend too much time on it today, this shift is significant because suddenly what's in the foreground, although it's still in the foreground, really is not the main focus. The focus is the background, what he's looking at. We don't even see the person. He represents our thoughts, or even, and I think I'm going to try and make the case, our feelings, and you'll see that when we look at Burke today. His feelings about the landscape, and it is a sublime landscape, which we'll see very shortly when we look at Burke. And we're eventually going to move, and I found this interesting in our discussion after our class last time when we're looking at the contemporary day, the influence of this sort of perspective on this, the movie, 2012, the horror movie. Well, and now we have a Buddhist monk on the top of presumably the Himalayas, seeing the world coming to ruin, and we feel his feelings about this and so forth, and we share his perspective. I argued, and I will continue to argue, that what happens in the Romantic period is that we move away from the Christian and, quite frankly, classical and a rational, orderly, intelligently designed world to one that is ruled by feelings and chaos. in which the feelings of the person are the center of our worldview. And that fits very much with Buddhism. So the Buddhist monk is often heroic in Western, or the noble savage, as I've said. The people who are closer to their feelings and in conjunction with nature become very much fashionable, not just among the left, but intellectually in general. The Dalai Lama suddenly becomes this great spiritual figure representing all religions. And inherent in that, I think, is a pantheism, which is certainly there in Eastern religions, because they think that God is in everything. There's in good and in evil. It's not that there's no good and evil, it's that we should be worshiping both powers, because both of them are gods worthy of our reverence in some ways. It's not that there isn't evil, but that evil needs to be given its due. That starts to come into the Western tradition, and for reasons of which I'm going to talk about in conjunction with Edmund Burke. But let me say what I said I was going to do, which is to summarize Johnson and then make the connection with Burke. But note to you that Burke is a decisive figure in the shift away from the neoclassical tradition, which would probably have been a matter of horror to him, and I don't think it was certainly his intention. But remember what I said to you about the Sublime, and we looked at Longinus, and we saw that the Sublime for Longinus was the most beautiful thing. The most beautiful thing. And he used various illustrations of this from various works, everything from Homer to even John's Gospel. He clearly had an acquaintance with that, and he said, this is sublime. This passage is sublime. And how is it that we can create the sublime? Well, that's been the question that preoccupies the whole critical tradition. How do we produce great literature? And who has produced great literature? For the Hellenistic critics, it was clearly those that we call the classics. Those were the ones that produced sublime literature, literature that was worthy of study, remembrance, emulation, imitation, repetition. And by doing that, we will ourselves be cultivating the very thing that we most admire. And when we come to Augustine, we'll see that he agreed in some sense with this perspective, and saw even in the accounts of the Egyptians, in that analogy that he uses at the end of book 2, he talks about plundering the Egyptians and their gold as a illustration for the analogy of how Christianity relates to cultures in general. There's all sorts of gold in the cultures of the world. Unfortunately, those that use the gold and value the gold don't know its true value, and they end up worshiping demons rather than the one true God. So what do we do with that then? Do we only read the Bible? Do we only, because it's God's revelation, everything that is in the Bible is true, do we just read that? And some of his critics say that we only need the scriptures and I don't need a guide in that. Augustine's argument is very much against that, and said actually you can't read the Bible without first understanding grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And you can't understand the natural world without an understanding of geometry and astronomy and music. These things are absolutely necessary. And numbers are significant in Scripture. They have, the significance of numbers is clear. Not just 3 and 7, but also 10 and 40. These numbers keep recurring, and they seem to have a pattern and a significance to them. Well, how do we understand number? We have to understand that in order to read the Bible properly. All the same, is it only the scriptures where we see those discussions of those 7 liberal arts? And the answer is no. We can get that in the classical tradition. And in fact, Augustine in book 2 says exactly that. We have to understand these 7 liberal arts in order to read scripture properly. So what we have there is a manifesto for Christians to read and engage with culture. not necessarily to say what the culture says. In fact, it's clear in Augustine's estimation that we don't agree with the pagans because they don't know who God is, but we can still learn from them. We can use their gold and we can reappropriate it and refashion it so that it's properly utilized. And the purpose of that then is so that the signs, oops, if I can spell, lead us to the race, the things, what's real and what's ultimately real. And the thing that is ultimately real, there's only one, that's God. So that's the purpose of all of these things. So it has a Christological or Trinitarian purpose in Augustine's estimation, and it is all to be understood in terms of love. Furthermore, which C.S. Lewis will end up calling the Ordo Amoris, because it's an order of love that is leading us not only forwards but onwards and upwards. And that's part of understanding things even like music. It has a scale, a ladder, it goes upwards. We can hear that in the different voices. And we understand then that there's a rationality to the universe that's also harmonious and beautiful. And we can see the goodness in it. And so education is supposed to engage with all that. So when Burke comes along and engages with this tradition, the sublime has been established as something of the utmost beauty. God himself is sublime because he's the most beautiful of all possible objects, because he is no object. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings the good news. Jesus says that he is the good shepherd is our usual translation, but actually in the Greek it says kalos hupomenos, the beautiful shepherd. It sounds odd in English for a man to call himself beautiful or self, but that's the word that's used there. And the intent is good, but the good and the beautiful are conjoined in Christ, of course. And everything that he says is true. So truth, beauty, and goodness, the Platonic triad, are conjoined in some sense in Christ. But of course, Christ contradicts the classical views of all these things precisely because he is also the suffering servant. This is something that's foolishness to the Greeks and the Romans. They will not understand the dignity of mankind, which Christ affirms by becoming incarnate and also by atoning for human sin on the cross. That is totally antithetical to them. They will not understand, in other words, the importance of faith, hope, and charity. These three theological virtues. And those three theological virtues will transpose even the temporal virtues. So I'm just giving you a vast summary of where we are right now. But there's the issue. The sublime represents a certain thing, and the neoclassical estimation is representative of it in some way. So Edmund Burke or Samuel Johnson will say, so a general take on Johnson, all great poetry consists in the new expression of universal or general truths. That's clear in Johnson. It's the new expression of universal or general truths. So there's something that's interesting about that. There is a novelty. He admits novelty is important, but it's not novelty in the radical sense of originality. If originality is meant, by which we mean originality means that no one has ever said or thought this before. If that's the definition of originality, Johnson would strongly disagree. There's nothing new under the sun. However, the expression of it can be fresh and new in that sense. But the reason that it's valid is because it expresses unchanging truths. So Johnson's quite clear on this, that all great poetry consists in the new expression of universal or general truths, and furthermore, that these truths are gathered in the observation of what he calls nature. And here's a slight change. In the imitation of nature rather than through poetic imitation. So and so for that reason, Shakespeare represents nature. because he doesn't follow the poets, he follows nature. And he'll say that the argument then is that it's not that Shakespeare never read any poets and that he's not influenced by them, but rather he's influenced by what they're observing. So that's what nature is. Now note that nature is not the green stuff and the blue sky. It's not. We're not so vulgar as to think that this is nature. This is not nature any more than this is nature. That's not what nature is. It's observing in the universal order of things, or the general order of things, that there are truths there, and those truths are observed. Whereas the poets who observe them are just observers, but we don't imitate the poets, we imitate what the poets were observing. So he's moving a bit away, even though he's in neoclassical, he's moving in the direction of and a shift towards nature as being the ultimate source of all poetic diction. It's a key shift. He is the foremost critic of the second half of the 18th century, rather. Samuel Johnson, great critic. So in his dissertation, Imlac's dissertation on poetry in chapter 10 of Rasselas, and then in the preface to Shakespeare, which an extract of which I had you read, and also in the Lives of the Poets, Johnson praises Shakespeare as a poet of nature, with all of that in mind. And he dispels the importance of the unities, the three unities. Remember we talked about those in conjunction with French neoclassical criticism. So he dismisses the unities and pushes it in the direction of nature. And what's interesting is that he nonetheless does not move towards full-blown naturalism or worship of nature. He says that we're still consciousness of fiction. So let's come to Edmund Burke then. Right Honorable Edmund Burke. This is published in 1823, but the Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, there's a real mouthful. This is the title. Typical 18th century title. It's very good for the internet. Word search is very descriptive. So it's a philosophical inquiry. Note that it's into the origin of our ideas. This is not actually into the sublime and the beautiful. It's into our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. Very important. It's not about the sublime and the beautiful. It's the origin of our idea. And it's about the origin of our ideas. Okay. Just bear that in mind. It's descriptive and it's not careless. And he's going to go back to origins. Where do these originate? What Burke is going to give us is a psychological account, more or less. What we would call a psychological account. He doesn't call it that, because psychology doesn't exist as a discipline. But where do these ideas originate? We have a thought we have an idea in our mind, and it originates from somewhere. Where does it originate from? Well, if you go back to what I said about Rousseau, it originates. There's two possibilities. It originates in our words, or it originates in our feelings. And he's going to connect it with the feelings. So oddly, surprisingly, Edmund Burke is very much influenced by Rousseau. But not just Rousseau, but also Herder and a whole series of critics of the day. Let me have a look at this at the outset. So he writes this in 1757. And he writes this before he becomes a famous politician. He's a young man. How old is he? 28? Born in 1729, so 57, that makes him, no, is it 37? 30, math is weak here. No, anyway, doesn't matter. He's not yet the famous politician, conservative, founder of conservative political philosophy. He's not yet commented on the revolution in France, which really marks him as the foremost conservative statesman of the day and ends up representing the political tradition of conservatism, which the father of modern political conservatism is Edmund Burke. This is when he's younger, and he's interested in aesthetics. Aesthetics, which is a new branch, by the way, of observation. So the word aesthetics is itself an 18th century invention. Let me also say that. If you study the history of thought, you will find that this word, which we use, is not used in the ancient world at all. It just means perception. It's associated, however, with the discussion of beauty. Everybody knows what an esthetician is, and when we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about the realm of the beautiful. But note that the reason that we can do this is because it's seen as a discrete area now that is separated from ethics and politics and so forth. We see these fragmentation of the humanities. When Aristotle is talking about poetics, or Horace, or any of the writers we've seen up to now, they would never have considered beauty or the sublime as a topic unto itself. The sole exception was Longinus. That's the only one I could find. So there's a treatise in the 18th century by the name of Baumgartner, who I'm not going to talk about here, but he is the one, I think, who coins the phrase aesthetics, and then it gets used thereafter. It becomes an area of study. But note that it's beauty now no longer connected with goodness. So the very thing that C.S. Lewis observes with lament in The Abolition of Man already is beginning in the mid-18th century. I would say beginning. It is full-blown present in the 18th century. And the reason it is because we think that perceptions of beauty originate in our ideas. And where do our ideas come from? For Plato, they exist rationally. They exist in something like, although he won't call it that, the mind of God. Christian tradition will present them. And Aristotle furthermore. Right? There's the beautiful, the good, the just, the true. These originate somewhere. We believe that they're ultimate and they all conjoin. What does the modern romantic view conclude? However, it concludes, it comes from our language, but our language originates in grunts and cries as an expression of our strong natural feelings. So it's a psychological expression more than anything else. Now, he'll get that from a whole series Burke will get this from a whole series of other thinkers. I don't have time to give you the foundations of romantic aesthetics. I spent a whole semester on this in Durham, and I can't recapitulate all that, but there's a long line of other theorists that he's appealing to here. But let's have a look at the outline that he presents to us here. So let me reduce this a little bit because I think you can see that all the same, and it gives you a better sense of the shift. But he begins with, and it's a 4-part discussion. He begins with taste. I'm going to skip over that. He wants to talk about the sublime and the beautiful. He makes all sorts of observations here. Talks about novelty, pain, and pleasure, the difference between the removal of pain and positive pleasure, delight and pleasure. He's talking about experiences, though, when he's talking about the origin of our ideas as sublime and the beautiful. Note that he's talking about extreme experiences. He's immediately pushed into the realm of experience, which is an odd thing. He's not describing anything other than extremities. Let me go to the passions that belong to self-preservation because this is important. So, this is why I didn't really want to use this, but novelty, because it's hard for me to click from one thing to the next. Note that Burke is doing, among other things, he will quote the Iliad in Greek, which he's reading in Greek. Assumes his audience can as well. rather interesting in itself. Joy and grief, I'll skip over that and come to the passions which belong to self-preservation. And I'll just read it. The chapters are very short, by the way, and easily readable. Most of the ideas which are capable of making a powerful impression on the mind. Go back to what I said about the mind last class. What do we mean by the mind? The res cogitans. It's that thinking thing. Whether simply of pain or pleasure or the modifications of those may be reduced nearly to these two heads. Okay. Self-preservation on the one hand and society on the other. Powerful motivations, either to preserve ourselves, fight or flight is what the psychologists will call it, that strong response of self-preservation, or society, which we will associate with love. To the ends of one or the other of which all our passions are calculated to an answer. Note what he has done here is that he's taken Augustine's Ordo Amoris, which is a unified ladder that all leads to one thing, and he's severed them and put them under two heads, not one, two. One of which will be perceived to be good and the other which will be perceived to be evil. Although there's good in both of them. Self-preservation is a good, just like society is. Let me move on. The passions which concern self-preservation mostly turn on pain or danger. The ideas of pain, sickness, and death fill the mind with strong emotions of horror. But life and health, though they put us in a capacity of being affected with pleasure, they make no such impression by the simple enjoyment. If we have health, we enjoy health. We don't think about it. We feel no pleasure in being healthy. We just think it's a normal state of affairs. Whereas if we're deprived of health, we feel we're under extreme duress. You don't even have to be in pain. We're weak. We're not feeling well. We notice it. We object to it. We don't object, or we don't take joy in being alive and being healthy. It's there. And for that reason, he's going to say that the feelings that give rise to pain, sickness, and death, which giving it away are associated with the sublime, is stronger than the beautiful, far stronger. Anyway, they make no such impression by the simple enjoyment. The passions, therefore, which are conversant about the preservations of the individual, turn chiefly on pain and danger, and they are the most powerful of all the passions. So let's talk about the sublime. What is the sublime? He's going to come up with something like a definition here, but it's more of an observation of various associations, because he's in the associationist Lockean school of psychological understanding of things. Locke is essential to Romanticism, by the way. Lockean psychology. Locke tends to be seen as in the conservative tradition. I think he might be, but he's not. He's misrepresenting the Christian view on these things in his appropriation. I'm not even going to get into my assertion right now. The sublime. This is book 1, section 7. Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. Note the reference always to the mind and the feeling that is produced by it. Don't think that the sublime and the beautiful have anything to do with words per se. They have to do with feelings. It's all about feelings. Burke's entire treatise in aesthetics, not that he calls it aesthetics, but a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, is all about feelings. Strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied with that the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. Without all doubt, the torments which we may be made to suffer are much greater in their effect on the body and the mind than any pleasures which the most learned voluptuary could suggest, or than the liveliest imagination, and the most sound and exquisitely sensible body could enjoy. Nay, I am in great doubt whether any man could be found who would earn a life of the most perfect satisfaction at the price of ending it in the torments which justice inflicted in a few hours on the late unfortunate regicide in France. Oh, when does that happen? 1789. This is a later edition. This is the 18-something edition. So I probably should find an earlier edition of the, like the actual 1757 expression of this. He's updated this to include politics. The late unfortunate regicide in France is in 1789. This is written in 1757. So this is a later edition. Still, yes.
The footnote says it happened in 1757.
What footnote? It says what happened?
The regicide.
Well, it didn't.
Okay.
It's just the footnote's wrong. I mean, the French Revolution, are you misreading it, or is it the footnote just some ignoramus? Anyway, let me go on. But as pain is stronger in its operation than pleasure, so death is in general a much more affecting idea than pain, because there are very few pains, however exquisite, which are not preferred to death. Nay, what generally makes pain itself, if I may say so, more painful is that it is considered as an emissary of this king of terrors. The reason that we fear pain is pain precedes death, and we fear death of all things the most. When danger or pain press too nearly, they are incapable of giving any delight and are simply terrible. So this isn't the sublime experience. If they're too painful, there's no sublimity whatsoever. You don't feel anything other than terror. You're caught up and there's no reflection on it, but the idea has to exist. That means there has to be some distance from it. So it's not when you're in pain that it's rather when you're removed from the pain and you can reflect on the pain and the danger and so forth. That's when it arises. But at certain distances and with certain modifications, they may be, and they are delightful. And we every day experience the cause of this. I shall endeavor to investigate thereafter. But let's start with a distinction that he made. So he talked about, remember, the preservation of the individual and the society. Now he wants to talk about the society, and it's a little digression. And he'll come back to the sublime and the beautiful. And remember, he said there were two heads. The other head, under which I class our passions, is that of society, which may be divided in two sorts. What types of society? One, the society of the sexes. Note that he doesn't call them the genders. It's not two genders, they're two sexes. Which answers the purposes of propagation. And the next, that more general society, which we have with men, that is the whole human race, and with other animals, and which we may in some sort be said to have even with the inanimate world. That's a society of a sort as well. The passions belonging to the preservation of the individual turn wholly on pain and danger. Those which belong to generation have their origin in gratifications and pleasures. The pleasure most directly belonging to this purpose is of a lively character, rapturous and violent, and confessedly the highest pleasure of sense. He's talking about sex as a pleasure of delight. It's not as powerful as the feeling of death, but it is powerful in its own sphere, in the sphere of society. And yet the absence of this so great an enjoyment scarce amounts to an uneasiness, and except at particular times, I don't think it affects at all. When men prescribe in what manner they are affected by pain and danger, they do not dwell on the pleasure or health of the comfort of security, and then lament the loss of these satisfactions. The whole turns upon the actual pains and horrors which they endure. But if you listen to the complaints of a forsaken lover, you observe that he insists largely on the pleasures which he hoped or enjoyed or hoped to enjoy, and on the perfection of the object of his desires. It is the loss which is always uppermost in his mind. The violent effects produced by love, which has sometimes been even wrought up to madness, is no objection to the rule we seek to establish. When men have suffered their imaginations to be long affected with any idea, it so wholly engrosses them as to shut out by degrees almost every other, and to break down every partition of the mind which would confine it. Any idea is sufficient for the purpose, from an infinite variety of causes. Okay, So what's the final cause of the difference between the two passions? One for self-preservation, the other society. The final cause between the two. We are strongly affected with whatever threatens the destruction of either, life or health. But we are not made to acquiesce in life and health. The simple enjoyment of them is not attended with any real pleasures. Less satisfied with that, we should give ourselves over to indolence and inaction and idolatry furthermore. On the other hand, the generation of mankind is a great purpose, and it is requisite that men should be animated to the pursuit of it by some great incentive. Procreation. What's the incentive for procreation? The highest pleasure. But as it is by no means designed to our constant busyness, it is not fit that the absence of this pleasure should be attended with any considerable pain. And this is really an interesting note here. The difference between men and brutes in this point seems to be remarkable. Men are at all times pretty equally disposed to the pleasures of love. It's not just in the spring, because they are guided to be guided by reason in the time and manner of indulging them. They have free will. Had any great pain arisen from the want of this satisfaction, reason, I'm afraid, would find great difficulty in the performance of its offices. But brutes who obey laws, in the execution of which was their own reason has but little share, have their stated seasons. And at such times it is not improbable that the sensation from their want is very troublesome, because the end must be then answered or missed, in many perhaps forever, as the inclination returns only with its season. So he defined the sublime. Now let's go to the discussion of the beautiful. Is it clear thus far at all where he's going? Yes.
Before you move on to the beautiful, could you maybe summarize what he's thinking the sublime means? Because after reading so much of Augustine and Longinus, his description is so different that I just kind of...
It's very, and I just want the summary here. No, I don't want that summary. Maybe I do want it. Is it going to list the chapters? I don't want, gosh, I shouldn't go on Wikipedia. No. That way lies madness. I want, is it going to give, I hate the internet. Oh my goodness, I hate this. I just want, is it going to, no, it's not going to do it. I just want this one. He's going to give all sorts of illustrations of things that are what he will call sublime. There are certain experiences that will fit under the sublime category. There are certain experiences that will fit under the beautiful category. And what is significant here is that he categorically differentiates them. They have nothing to do with one another. Not only do they have nothing to do with one another, they're opposite. And they serve opposite purposes. And there's a utility to both of them, having said that. It's a utilitarian argument, among other things. So the utility of the beautiful is to procreate the human race. The utility of the sublime is to keep people in order. It's politically useful to terrify people, to use the sublime. So he will find a utility for it. And the experience in general, he's going to talk about the reason why we find the beautiful beautiful, and what the reason why we find the sublime to be sublime will turn on the issue of power. I'm going to come back to this, but power becomes the chief differentiation, how we experience power. The beautiful we experience because we feel powerful. The sublime we experience because we feel powerless. Something greater than us threatens to annihilate us. Death, obviously. We feel powerless. That is necessary. So the power dynamics become central to this. It's not just that he separates and puts it under two heads, the sublime and the beautiful. But that the chief pivot point even is our relation to power. You will not find this in anything that emerges before this. It's a novel idea, as far as I can tell. It's not that nobody writes on power before this, but the dynamic there is seen. It's not seen the way Burke is seeing it. Let's look at beauty, and then, but I'm going to come back to that, and I'll try and go back earlier, and I'll show you the outline of the various possible sublime experiences and the various possible beautiful experiences, and then I will generalize about both of them, and then make the distinction. So on beauty, the passion which belongs to generation, merely as such is lust only. Okay, this is evident in brutes. They also are motivated by generation, and we share that with the brutes. This is evident in brutes whose passions are more unmixed and which pursue their purposes more directly than ours. The only distinction they observe with regard to their mates is that of sex. They incline to the opposite sex because that's how they procreate. Whereas in humanity, the sex is almost untethered. Homosexuality ensues. There's all sorts of deviant sexual proclivities and so forth. That's possible among human beings. You don't see that on animals. Somebody will say, well, my dog, a dog does the humping action on another dog's leg and thing, or my leg or whatever. Yeah, that's dominance behavior. It's not the same thing. So you're confusing the dominance behavior with sexual activity. The dog doesn't, it's a different thing driving that. You're making a false conclusion based on similarities there. So that of sex. It is true that they stick severally to their own species in preference to all others. So horses don't chase down dogs, or dogs horses and so forth. They stick to their species, and right? But this preference, I imagine, does not arise from any sense of beauty which they find in their species, as Mr. Addison supposes, but from a law of some other kind, to which they are subject, the law of species and of kind, which is mentioned in Scripture. And this we may fairly conclude from their apparent want of choice amongst those objects to which the barriers of their species have confined them. But man, who is a creature adapted to a greater variety and intricacy of relations, connects with general passion the idea of some social qualities which direct and heighten the appetite with which he has in common with all the other animals. And as he is not designed like them to live at large, it is fit that he should have something to create a preference and to fix his choice. And this in general should be some sensible quality, as no other can so quickly, so powerfully, or so surely produce its effect. The object, therefore, of this mixed passion, which we call love, is the beauty of the sex. Men are carried to the sex in general, as it is the sex, and by the common law of nature, but they are attached to particulars by personal beauty. I call beauty, note now that he's talking about it, first of all, in the discussion of beauty, I should also say that unlike Longinus, who's talking about beauty or sublimity in relation to artistic creation, and in that sense, he's now talking about it in a very empiricist sense, as a physical quality, something that we can observe in a painting. And it has proportions, and so there are certain features there. He's thinking very much in a physical sense of beauty, and even sublimity. And Longinus is not talking about that when he's talking about the sublime and discussing John's Gospel or the passage from the Iliad, or one of the great rhetorical speeches of the ancients. He's talking now about physical characteristics. So as an empiricist in that tradition. So he calls it a social quality, for where women and men, and not only they, but when other animals give us a sense of joy and pleasure in beholding them, and there are many that do so, they inspire us with sentiments of tenderness and affection towards their persons. We like to have them near us, and we enter willingly into a kind of relation with them, unless we should have strong reasons to the contrary. But to what end, in many cases, this was designed, I am unable to discover, for I see no greater reason for a connection between man and several animals who are attired in so engaging a manner than between him and some others who entirely want this attraction or possess it in a far weaker degree. But it is probable that Providence did not make even this distinction, but with a view to some great end, though we cannot perceive distinctly what it is, as his wisdom is not our wisdom, nor our ways his ways. Okay. Second branch society in general, I'm going to skip over that. Let me go back to the beginning here. But note that he connects it with physical characteristics in the opposite sex. And specifically, he talks, and we might say he's sexist, and he's talking as a man of women. He's not even talking about how women might perceive men to be beautiful. He has no interest in that. So here's the, I'll do it in a smaller sense of this. So part one, general discussion, imitation, ambition. And now in part two, he will move specifically to the sublime. So part two is dedicated to the sublime. Part three is dedicated to the beautiful. Okay, so all of the things that in part two are little chapter distinctions are related to sublimity. And those chapter distinctions in part three are related to beauty. And then in part four, he's going to come back and make summary statements. So what is it that gives rise to the sublime then? Note all of the associations here. Terror, obscurity. Note that he's already said that the strongest expression of the sublime is our association of the idea of death. That is of all terrible things, death is the most terrible of all. Terror, obscurity. Look, obscurity. Difference between clearness and obscurity. Power, privation, and absence. And if you want to go to a classical definition of evil as the absence of good, you wouldn't be far off it, a privation of something. Vastness, infinity, succession and uniformity, magnitude in building, infinity in pleasing objects, difficulty, magnificence, or even then its opposites. Light in building, like a very bright, overwhelming light, can also be the cause of the sublime. So can loud sounds, or suddenness, shock, horror, come around the corner and that's a sublime experience. You're terrified. A childhood accident, watching a parent die is a sublime experience. Watching a loved one die right in front of you, watching somebody get hit by a car, especially if there's a strong association, those create a sublime feeling because they are sudden and they are overwhelmingly associate them with death and so forth. These are powerful things. Cries of animals even, smell and taste, bitters and stenches, feeling, pain. These are all causes of sublime ideas. I'll come back to the better illustration in a minute. Let me compare and contrast them with beauty. When we come to beauty, we find proportion. Proportion is not the cause of beauty in vegetables, not the cause in animals, not in the human species. How about fitness? What do we mean by this? And the beauty applied to qualities of the mind. What's the real cause of beauty? And look at the other aspects of things that will be beautiful. Beautiful things are small. Beautiful things are smooth. Beautiful things have a gradual variation, not sharp. Doesn't suggest muscularity, but roundness, smoothness. Women's bodies are beautiful. Men's bodies are more sublime because they're too sharp and angular. If we're thinking of like David, Michelangelo's David, that's more of a sublime. Men are inclined more because they're just more defined. All that are inclined to this is sublime as opposed to a beautiful. Delicacy. Think of all the things we associate with beauty. beautiful in feeling, beautiful in sound, taste and smell, sublime, the beautiful compared. I will come to that in a second. So I'll have to skip forward. Let me see the where I wanted to go. I want to go to 85 first and then read a series of extracts. Oh no. Pages don't match up. That's not good. Oh, 2 secs. I will come to infinity in a second. Vastness, privation, no, I don't want to go over this. It's too long. Power, I'll skip over power and come to privation. All general privations are great. So a sense of a lack of something. Because they are all terrible. Vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. I will say that all 4 of these things you will note as part of post-romantic writing, painting, music, you name it. The horror novel, the sci-fi novel, speculative fiction. In terms of painting, you will note the shift not only from the fogginess here in the background, that becomes more and more part, not just in the sense of the impressionists, but then you get the gradual sense, so that if you go to an art gallery, you'll see a blank canvas. In terms of music, you'll go from the, not just from the music of Bach to Mozart, but you start to move towards an impressionist period, and more you start to get into, let's say, John Cage, where you have a recording where there's no sound. So there's a move towards a type of sublimity, an absence of sound as the artistic ideal. And with what a fire of imagination, yet with what severity of judgment has Virgil amassed all of these circumstances, where he knows that all of the images of a tremendous dignity ought to be united at the mouth of hell. That's where he associates all of these things. Vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. The great classical work, Virgil's Aeneid. Where, before he unlocks the secrets of the great deep, he seems to be seized with a religious horror and to retire astonished at the boldness of his own design. I'll skip over the Latin. And ye subterranean gods, whose awful sway, as in awful, as in the sense as it fills us with awe and terror. The gliding ghosts and silent shades obey. O chaos here and phlegethon profound, whose solemn empire stretches wide around. Give me, ye great tremendous powers, to tell of scenes and wonders in the depth of hell. Give me your mighty secrets to display from those black realms of darkness to the day. Okay? Vastness. Greatness of dimension is a powerful cause of the sublime. Why? All of these things give us a sense mind. If we feel power, it's beautiful. If we feel powerlessness, it's sublime. Note the origin of our ideas of these things is the reflection of the mind on itself in the experience of these things. That it's our feelings that arise from these experiences that are the object of our discussion here. So this man, once again, when he looks out, we're not looking at what he's looking at, we're thinking about what he must be feeling in that particular situation. We can see ourselves in his shoes. He feels his finitude. He feels his mortality. He feels his smallness. All of these things in a sublime landscape. You'll find that in the Romantic period and onwards, that the typical Gothic landscape is a sublime landscape. The typical building that you encounter is a ruin. It's always a ruin. the heroes tend to be monsters of some sort. I've already talked about the fact that they're orphans and alienated in some sense just by virtue of who they are. It's a great illustration of this shift to the sublime in our nature, dissociated from beauty. Note also that the thing that is described as beautiful ends up being a woman's body or a child's body. That's beautiful. Why is it beautiful? It sounds almost perverse. The reason why what we call, or little lambs or baby animals or anything smooth and unthreatening and so forth, is because we feel our sense of power in that experience. We men feel our sense of power vis-a-vis the opposite sex. And that's what gives us the feeling of beauty. You might think, well, that's rather horrible. You're thinking about your power. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking of my feelings of tenderness towards these things. It makes me think about myself, or more, it makes me think about my own feelings there. So this is a very different thing than what Longinus is talking about when he's talking about the sublime. That's obvious. And the dissociation from beauty is another thing. So then, but you can imagine what the feminists are going to make of this. And the relation to the opposite sex. And for good or for ill, sometimes it's exploiting that, and other times it's deriding it. But in either case, I think this idea of power being the chief dynamic that leads to our perception of aesthetics is deeply problematic, as is the severance of beauty from sublimity. It's deeply problematic, and it's an insoluble problem if you accept that the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful are originated by our feelings, which he seems to assert without qualification. All of which he gets, and I think it's a downstream consequence of a shift to the idea of the origins of our language being in our strong feelings. It's a linguistic thing first, before it becomes an aesthetic thing, and it becomes a distinction between sublime and beautiful and so forth. So greatness of dimension. Where does this section here? Burke, Sublime. No, can you not just, not Wikipedia. No. There we go. No, it's still the terror. Yeah, okay, we'll get to part 2. It's good. Let's go back to part 2. I thought it was in section 7, so this is why I'm troubled here. It must come before it. When he comes to describe Milton's portrait of death in Paradise Lost, he talks about it and cites Milton as the great illustration of this. There it is. Oh, that's why. It's the same subject continued. I do not know of any paintings, bad or good, that produce the same effect. So that poetry, with all its obscurity, has a more general as well as a more powerful dominion over the passions than any other art. And I think there are reasons in nature why the obscure idea, so this is obscurity as giving rise to a sublime experience. This is why this is sublime. It's an obscure landscape. If you can see it rationally and clearly, then you have power over it. If you're blinded by light, by terror, then you can experience the sublime. Or your eye doesn't meet anything to obstruct it or to see. You can't see. A sublime landscape is looking out over Lake Ontario and seeing nothing but horizon. Or in Saskatchewan, looking out on the wheat fields, and it's just all you see is sky, and the sky seems immense, enormous, bigger than you. You feel your smallness. It seems greater than your ability to take in. That's a sublime experience. It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration and chiefly excites our passions. Knowledge and acquaintance make the most striking causes affect but little. It is thus with the vulgar, and all men are as the vulgar in what they do not understand. The ideas of eternity and infinity are among the most affecting we have. And perhaps there is nothing of which we really understand so little as of infinity and eternity. We do not anywhere meet a more sublime description than this justly celebrated one of Milton, wherein he gives the portrait of Satan with a dignity so suitable to the subject. Oh, this isn't actually the passage I'm after, but it's a description of Satan as sublime. He, above the rest in shape and gesture proudly eminent, stood like a tower. His form had not yet lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined, and the excess of glory obscured. As when the sun new risen looks through the horizontal misty air shorn of its beams, or from behind the moon in dim eclipse disastrous twilight sheds on half the nations, and with fear of change perplexes monarchs. Here is a very noble picture. And in what does this poetical picture consist? In 8 images of a tower, an archangel, the sun rising through mist, or in an eclipse, the ruin of monarchs and the revolutions of kingdoms. The mind is hurried out of itself by a crowd of great and confused images, which affect because they are crowded and confused. For separate them and you lose much of the greatness, and join them and you infallibly lose the clearness. The images raised by poetry are always of this obscured kind. There's the sublime obscurity. Is that Longinus' definition of the sublime? It's through the filter of the eye. And it connects it with power. And it separates the sublime and the beautiful. Though in general the effects of poetry are by no means to be attributed to the image it raises, which point we shall examine at large hereafter. But painting, when we have allowed for the pleasure of imitation, can only affect simply by the images it presents, and even in painting, a judicious obscurity in some things contributes to the effect of the picture, because the images in painting are exactly similar to those in nature. And in nature, dark, confused, uncertain images have a greater power on the fancy to form the grander passions than those that are clear and so forth. So he talks about this. It's terrific stuff. Where is the passage in which he talks about death? I wish I had a better. I'm going to try one last time without the summary. There must be one where I really hesitate, but no, this. No, it's going to cut me off. It's not going to allow me to see it all. Forget it. When he comes to the portrait of death, remember the description of death in Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 2, line 666. Milton, Paradise Lost, Book 2, Death. Okay, well, I'll have to do the hard work myself. There you go. There you go. Burke will talk about this passage. The other shape, line 666. By the way, 666, the Antichrist. Milton's associating death with the Antichrist. Interesting. The thing that takes away life and is the thing that is opposed to Christ. That's Milton's implicit explanation here, because he does put it right at this point. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none, distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called, that shadow seemed, for each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly crown, had on. description of death. He said, everything about this is sublime. Everything about it. It's obscurity, it's dark, it's confused in its imagery, it's terrifying, it's associated with hell and night, and yet none of the images, even the idea of a crown, is put on the likeness of a head, but not an actual head. So we're meeting a figure that is impossible for us to even discern as a figure, and that's what death is. It's a specter. It's a shadow. Tolkien will use this in The Lord of the Rings, I'm absolutely convinced. Just like he'll raid Macbeth for images. He takes Milton and uses this idea all over the place. In the description of the Balrog, in the description of the Nine Riders, in the description of Sauron himself, right? In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. That's a sublime landscape. As I say, putting it in a film deprives it of its terror. It's not the filmmaker's fault. As soon as you see it, you no longer are terrified. It's like in a horror movie, you're horrified when you fear what's coming. And as soon as the bad guy comes out, you can make him as ugly as he can be. It's sort of like, at first it's, and then it's like, oh, okay. And you just get over it. It's a man wearing a hockey mask, or it's a, it's a puppet of some sort. Crawls out from under the bed, comes out nasty, a clown, who knows what. Terrifying, but it's not the figure itself anymore. It's just like, oh, okay, well, it's just a little, just going to take an axe to him or a fire, and you can't burn him, whatever. But those are the portraits of sublimity, and I think I traced most of the main features of it. But Burke's discussion of the sublime and the beautiful, I think, has vast repercussions. It changes the whole discussion of aesthetics away from the sublime as the matter of utmost beauty towards the matter of utmost horror. And so then if you want to look in the novel and in poetry and in art in general and Western culture in general, there comes an obsession with death and ugliness and horror and nihilism. As it says in Scripture, we become what we worship. For good and for ill, we become what we worship. In the Bible, it speaks about, creating, the insanity of idolatry. You worship little stones and little pieces of wood that you've carved out for yourself. How ridiculous! And you bend down and you worship them. What do we worship here? We worship the mind. And we worship ourselves and our associations of the divine with our projections of our sense of terror onto God, who is impersonal. It's a vast shift. I've sketched it out. I'll leave it with that. I hope